Listen carefully, because what I am about to say is not for those who want comfort. It is for those who are ready to confront themselves. There is a level of living that demands more than talent, more than desire, more than motivation. It demands mastery over your inner world. And most people never rise because they are ruled by what they feel instead of what they are called to do. You were not designed to be a slave to your emotions. You were designed to govern them. Yet look around and you will see lives being built and destroyed not by circumstance alone, but by emotional instability. One moment of anger ruins relationships. One moment of fear cancels destiny. One moment of sadness becomes an identity. And people start calling it personality, when in reality it is lack of discipline. Understand this deeply. Emotion is a signal, not a master. It is information, not instruction. But when emotion becomes the driver, purpose loses direction. You cannot build anything stable on shifting feelings. You cannot lead people when your inner world is in chaos. And you cannot fulfill responsibility when your reactions are stronger than your vision. There are individuals who are gifted, intelligent, even anointed in potential, but they remain ineffective because they react instead of respond. Reaction is emotional. Response is intentional. Reaction is immediate. Response is governed. And the difference between those two determines whether a person becomes influential or remains inconsistent. You must learn to outgrow yourself emotionally. Not suppress what you feel, but govern it. There is a maturity that comes when you realize not every feeling deserves expression, not every thought deserves agreement, and not every emotion deserves action. Some things you feel are simply noise trying to interrupt your assignment. Strength is not loud. Emotional strength is often quiet restraint. It is the ability to remain stable when everything inside you wants to collapse. It is choosing discipline when anger feels justified. It is choosing silence when ego wants validation. It is choosing consistency when mood says quit. Many people mistake emotional expression for authenticity, but truth without discipline becomes destruction. Authenticity without governance becomes chaos. You can be real and still be responsible. You can feel deeply and still act wisely. You can be emotional and still not be controlled by emotion. There is a higher standard for those who are called to lead anything meaningful. Leadership is not about how you perform when things are easy. Leadership is revealed when pressure exposes what you are made of. If frustration can shift your character, then your character is not yet strong enough to carry responsibility. If disappointment can remove your discipline, then your discipline is not yet mature. You must stop negotiating with your emotions. The more you negotiate with what you already know is right, the weaker you become. Every time you say, "I don't feel like it," and you obey that feeling, you are training yourself into limitation. And over time, your life begins to shrink to the size of your mood. There is a difference between feeling tired and being governed by tiredness. There is a difference between being hurt and being controlled by hurt. There is a difference between being afraid and allowing fear to make decisions for you. Growth begins when you stop allowing temporary states to dictate permanent direction. You were not created to be reactive. You were created to be intentional. Purpose requires consistency, and consistency requires emotional governance. The greatest enemy of your future is not what you lack externally, it is what you fail to control internally. There will be moments when life presses you, when people misunderstand you, when doors close without explanation. In those moments, your emotions will rise. But rising emotion is not an instruction to abandon discipline. It is a test of mastery. It is showing you what still governs you. A person who is emotionally weak will always interpret challenges as personal attacks. But a person growing in maturity understands that pressure is not punishment, it is preparation. Every difficult moment is revealing whether you are still controlled by how you feel or anchored in what you know you must become. You cannot fulfill responsibility while indulging emotional instability. Responsibility demands sacrifice. It demands restraint. It demands that you sometimes carry weight without expressing everything you feel about the weight. Because leadership is not therapy, it is stewardship. There is a level where you must decide that your emotions will no longer dictate your direction. You will feel things, yes, but you will not obey everything you feel. You will acknowledge anger, but you will not become destructive. You will acknowledge fear, but you will not become paralyzed. You will acknowledge sadness, but you will not become stagnant. This is where discipline becomes your greatest ally. Discipline is not punishment, it is protection. It protects your future from your temporary state. It protects your purpose from your unstable moments. It protects your calling from emotional interference. And this is not easy. It requires constant internal correction. It requires confronting yourself when no one is watching. It requires telling yourself no when everything inside you says yes to quitting, to reacting, to escaping, to avoiding. Responsibility. There is a reason many never step into leadership, never build lasting impact, never sustain success. It is not because they lack opportunity, it is because they lack emotional governance. They cannot be consistent because they are too responsive to how they feel in the moment. But there is something greater within you that refuses to settle for instability. There is a deeper calling that demands maturity. And maturity is not age, it is control. It is the ability to remain aligned with purpose even when emotion is loud. You must begin to see your emotions as something you manage, not something that manages you. Because every time you surrender to emotional impulse, you weaken your authority over your own life. And a life without self-governance becomes vulnerable to everything and accountable to nothing. There is a strength that develops when you stop explaining your reactions and start correcting them. When you stop justifying emotional outbursts and start mastering emotional restraint. When you stop living from impulse and start living from conviction. And in that place, something shifts. You begin to realize that stability is not absence of emotion, it is mastery over it. You begin to understand that peace is not the absence of pressure, it is the presence of control under pressure. And you begin to see that your future is not waiting for perfect conditions, but for a disciplined mind that refuses to be ruled by momentary feelings. Because the moment you decide to no longer obey your emotions as authority over your decisions, you begin to reclaim power that was quietly slipping away from you day by day. You begin to realize that every time you reacted without thinking, every time you spoke out of impulse, every time you withdrew because of how you felt, you were surrendering leadership over your own life. And that is where real transformation begins, not when your circumstances change, but when your internal governance shifts. When you stop asking, how do I feel about this, and start asking, what must I become through this? You begin to operate from identity instead of impulse, from conviction instead of comfort, from responsibility instead of reaction. There are people who will never understand this level of living because they are still negotiating with their moods. They wake up and consult their emotions before they consult their purpose. If they feel good, they engage life. If they feel low, they withdraw from responsibility. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to build a life that is completely dictated by instability. But you were never meant to live that way. You were meant to rise above internal fluctuations. You were meant to stand firm when feelings shift. You were meant to remain consistent even when motivation disappears. Because true discipline is not what you do when you feel strong. It is what you do when you feel nothing at all. There is a quiet war happening inside every individual. A war between what is necessary and what is comfortable. Between what is required and what is desired. Between what builds the future and what entertains the present. An emotional weakness always sides with comfort. It always chooses ease over endurance. It always chooses escape over engagement. But strength, real strength, is not found in avoidance. It is found in confrontation. It is found in the decision to stay in the process when everything in you wants to run. It is found in the ability to sit with discomfort and still act with clarity. Because clarity is not the absence of emotion. It is the dominance of purpose over emotion. You must understand that your life will never rise above the level of your emotional discipline, not your intelligence, not your opportunities, not your environment. Your emotional governance determines your ceiling. And if you are easily offended, easily discouraged, easily distracted, then you are not yet ready for the weight of impact you claim to desire. There is a reason why responsibility increases with maturity. Because maturity is proven through emotional stability. The more stable you become internally, the more weight you are trusted to carry externally. And yet many want authority without alignment. They want influence without inner order. They want leadership without emotional mastery. But life does not respond to desire alone. Life responds to discipline. It responds to consistency. It responds to the person who shows, regardless of how they feel. The one who continues even when motivation is absent. The one who refuses to abandon commitment because emotion changed direction. And in that place, something begins to break within you. Not your identity, but your dependency on emotional approval. You stop needing to feel ready before you act. You stop waiting for perfect internal conditions before you move forward. You start to understand that readiness is created through action, not emotion. There will be days when everything inside you resists what you know you must do. Days when silence feels heavy. Days when discipline feels like a burden. Days when quitting feels justified. But those are the exact moments that define whether you are ruled by emotion or governed by purpose. Because purpose does not disappear when emotion shifts. Purpose remains constant. And if you are truly aligned with it, then your feelings must learn to submit to it, not redefine it. That is where authority over self is established. Not when everything is easy, but when everything inside you is in disagreement, and yet you still move forward with clarity. You begin to notice something powerful when you live this way. Your life becomes less reactive and more intentional. Your decisions become less impulsive and more strategic. Your presence becomes less unstable and more grounded. People begin to sense reliability in you, not because you never feel, but because you are no longer controlled by what you feel. And still, this is only the beginning of what emotional governance truly requires, because there are deeper layers within you that will be tested, areas where emotion disguises itself as intuition, where fear presents itself as wisdom, where comfort pretends to be peace, and you must learn to discern the difference between what is real guidance and what is internal noise trying to reroute your direction. And in those moments you will have to stand firm in a way that even your own thoughts begin to question your consistency, because emotional maturity is not only about controlling what you feel in obvious moments. It is about discerning what you accept as truth in subtle ones. When doubt starts to sound reasonable, when hesitation starts to feel responsible, when delay starts to feel like wisdom, but underneath it all is still the same force trying to pull you away from obedience to purpose. And if you are not trained in emotional discipline, you will call it discernment when it is actually fear. You will call it patience when it is actually avoidance. You will call it reflection when it is actually paralysis. And that is why so many people remain stuck for years in cycles that feel familiar but are never fruitful, because they have learned how to justify emotional comfort instead of confronting emotional resistance. They have mastered the language of delay. They have become fluent in explaining why now is not the right time, why they are not ready yet, why circumstances are not aligned, but the truth remains unchanged beneath all of it. That discipline does not wait for perfect conditions. It creates direction within imperfect ones. You must come to a place where you stop arguing with what you already know is required of you. Because deep down, there are things you already understand, decisions you already know you need to make, steps you already know you need to take. But emotion keeps offering alternatives that feel easier in the moment. And if you are not careful, you will build a life around emotional negotiation instead of purposeful execution. There is a difference between being thoughtful and being controlled by thought. There is a difference between being sensitive and being unstable. There is a difference between being aware of emotion and being governed by it. And maturity is learning to stand in that space where you acknowledge what you feel without surrendering authority to it. You will discover that most of your breakthroughs are not blocked by external barriers, they are delayed by internal resistance. And that resistance often disguises itself as emotional reasoning. It tells you to wait until you feel confident. It tells you to wait until fear subsides. It tells you to wait until clarity becomes absolute. But clarity rarely comes before movement. It often follows obedience. This is where many abandon their assignment without realizing it, because they confuse emotional discomfort with wrong direction. But growth always feels uncomfortable at first. Expansion always feels unfamiliar at the beginning. And every significant shift in your life will first challenge your emotional stability before it rewards your discipline. You are being shaped in those unseen moments where no one is applauding you, where no one is validating your effort, where no one is affirming your decisions, and yet you still choose to remain consistent. That is where identity is formed. Not in public recognition, but in private resistance. Not in applause, but in discipline when silence surrounds you. And if you continue in that process, something begins to happen internally that cannot be easily explained. Your reactions begin to slow down. Your responses become more deliberate. Your emotional highs and lows lose their authority over your direction. You stop being easily moved by circumstances, and you start becoming anchored in something deeper than circumstance itself. But even then, the testing does not stop because emotional weakness is not defeated once, it is mastered daily in repeated choices. in small moments of restraint, in continuous decisions to prioritize purpose over impulse. And there will still be moments where everything in you wants to revert, wants to react, wants to escape, and in those moments you will have to stand in that internal tension and refuse to abandon what you have already committed to just because your internal pressure rises again. Because emotional maturity is not a destination you arrive at once, it is a state you maintain under pressure, under delay, under misunderstanding, under silence, under opposition that does not announce itself loudly but instead slowly wears at your consistency until you are tempted to compromise your standards for temporary relief. And this is where many people misinterpret their own struggle. They assume that feeling resistance means they are on the wrong path, when in reality resistance is often the confirmation that they are finally moving in the right direction, because anything that has the power to transform you will also trigger internal opposition. And if you are not emotionally disciplined, you will interpret that opposition as a sign to retreat instead of a signal to endure. You must learn to recognize that emotional discomfort is not always danger. Sometimes it is development. It is the stretching of your capacity to remain stable when instability would be easier. It is the reshaping of your internal structure so that you can carry weight you could not carry before. But if you keep running from discomfort, you will keep limiting your capacity without realizing you are doing it to yourself. There is a level of discipline where you no longer need external pressure to do what is right. You are no longer waiting for deadlines, consequences, or motivation to activate your responsibility. You simply move because your identity demands it. You act because consistency is who you are becoming, not something you occasionally practice when conditions are favorable. And in that space, emotional fluctuations begin to lose their authority. They still exist, but they no longer govern. You feel them, but you no longer follow them blindly. You observe them, but you no longer obey them automatically. That separation between feeling and following is where real strength begins to manifest. Because most people are not weak because they lack ability, they are weak because they lack internal separation. They merge with every feeling they experience. If anger arises, they become anger. If fear arises, they become fear. If doubt arises, they become doubt. And in that merging, they lose objectivity, they lose direction, they lose consistency, and eventually they lose momentum. But when you begin to stand apart from your emotions, when you begin to observe them without surrendering to them, you create space for wisdom to operate. You create space for clarity to emerge beyond impulse. You create space for decisions that are not contaminated by temporary internal noise. And this is not suppression. This is governance. Suppression denies emotion. Governance acknowledges emotion but refuses its authority. And that difference determines whether your life is being built on stability or reaction. There will be moments where everything within you will try to convince you that you deserve to respond emotionally, that you deserve to react, that you deserve to release everything you are feeling without restraint. But you must learn in those moments that not everything you feel deserves expression. Not everything you experience deserves action. And not everything that rises within you deserves to shape your next decision. Because if it does, then you are no longer leading your life. You are simply being carried by it. And a life that is carried by emotion will always drift without direction. Because emotion is not stable enough to sustain long-term vision. It is reactive by nature. It shifts with circumstances. It rises and falls with perception. And if you anchor your decisions in something that is constantly moving, then your outcomes will always be inconsistent, no matter how strong your intentions are. So the real question is not whether you feel deeply, because you will. The real question is whether you are disciplined enough to remain committed when what you feel tries to rewrite what you already know. And that is where identity is tested, not in the absence of emotion, but in the presence of it. And it is loud enough to demand attention and strong enough to demand compliance. There are people who have confused emotional intensity with spiritual depth, but intensity without control is not depth, it is instability. True depth is measured by how still you can remain within yourself when everything around you is pulling you into reaction. It is the ability to think clearly when pressure is loud, to choose wisely when emotion is persuasive, to remain consistent when internal resistance is strong enough to justify deviation. And this is where discipline becomes not just a habit, but a form of internal authority. Because discipline is not about forcing yourself endlessly. It is about training yourself to obey what you have already decided is right, even when the feeling in the moment tries to negotiate a different outcome. And the more you obey emotion over principle, the weaker your internal authority becomes, until eventually you are no longer making decisions, you are simply responding to internal impulses as they appear. But there is another level of living where you reclaim that authority, where you begin to notice emotion without immediately reacting to it, where you can feel anger without becoming destructive, where you can feel fear without becoming passive, where you can feel sadness without becoming stagnant. That space between feeling and action is where leadership is formed, because leadership is not the absence of emotional experience, it is the mastery of response under emotional pressure. And when you begin to live from that place consistently, something shifts in your life that is not immediately visible but deeply transformative. Your decisions begin to compound with clarity. Your relationships begin to stabilize because you are no longer reactive. Your direction becomes more predictable, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer unstable within yourself. Still, the process continues, because emotional discipline is not a single victory, it is a continuous alignment. There will still be moments where old patterns try to resurface, where impulse tries to reclaim authority, where reaction tries to disguise itself as urgency. And in those moments you will have to decide again, with the same level of seriousness, the same level of clarity, the same level of internal firmness, whether you will continue to govern yourself or whether you will allow what you feel in that moment to quietly take back control. And if you are not careful, even a small compromise in those moments can begin to shift the entire direction of your life without you even realizing it. Because emotional compromise rarely announces itself as a major failure, it begins as a small justification, a slight delay, a minor exception, a moment where you tell yourself it is understandable, it is justified, it is harmless. But every time you allow emotion to override principle, you are not just reacting, you are reshaping your internal standards. And over time, those small shifts accumulate into a new identity, an identity where discipline is no longer automatic, where consistency is no longer natural, where obedience to purpose becomes conditional instead of absolute. That is how people drift away from their calling without a dramatic moment, without a clear decision, but through repeated emotional concessions that slowly erode their foundation. You must understand that your future is not only being built by what you do, but also by what you allow. What you permit emotionally in moments of weakness becomes the structure of your habits. And what becomes habitual eventually becomes identity. So emotional discipline is not just about controlling reactions in the moment. It is about protecting the architecture of your future self. There are moments where life will place pressure on you in a way that feels personal, where it feels like everything is testing your patience, your endurance, your sanity, and in those moments your emotions will try to convince you that you are justified in abandoning consistency, justified in reacting, justified in breaking alignment. But justification is not always truth. Sometimes it is simply emotion looking for permission. And this is where maturity steps in, not to deny what you feel, but to evaluate it, to question it, to refuse automatic obedience to it. Because not every internal voice deserves agreement, and not every internal pressure deserves release through action. Some things are meant to be observed, processed, and passed through without becoming behavior. When you reach that level of internal governance, you begin to notice something powerful. You begin to realize that you are no longer as easily controlled by external events because you are no longer internally unstable. You are no longer easily distracted because your focus is not constantly being hijacked by emotional fluctuations. You are no longer easily discouraged because your identity is no longer tied to temporary outcomes. And yet, even at that stage, you remain in training, because emotional discipline is not a final state where you become immune to feeling. It is a continuous practice of returning to alignment every time deviation tries to occur. It is the quiet decision made repeatedly to stay consistent when inconsistency would feel easier, to stay aligned when misalignment would feel justified, to stay anchored when everything within you is trying to drift toward immediate relief instead of long-term responsibility. And the deeper you go into this discipline, the more you begin to understand that emotional weakness is not simply about feeling too much. It is about lacking structure within yourself to contain what you feel without being overwhelmed by it. It is not the presence of emotion that creates instability. It is the absence of governance over it. So you begin to build that governance deliberately, through repetition, through restraint, through conscious correction of impulse, through choosing response over reaction again and again until it becomes who you are, rather than what you struggle to remember. But even then, the pressure does not stop, the tests do not disappear. The internal conflict does not fully cease, because as long as you are growing, there will always be moments where what you feel tries to challenge what you have decided. And in those moments you will still have to stand firm in yourself and refuse to let emotion redefine your direction. Because direction is sacred when it is rooted in purpose. And if you allow emotion to constantly rewrite it, then you are not walking in purpose. You are wandering through preference. And preference is never stable enough to carry destiny. You must come to a place where you stop treating emotional intensity as a signal to abandon discipline. Instead, you interpret it as a signal to reinforce it. The stronger the internal pressure becomes, the more deliberate your response must be. Because pressure does not reveal weakness alone, it reveals what is not yet governed within you. And this is where the transformation becomes undeniable. Not when life becomes easier, but when you become stronger inside of difficulty. When you no longer need ideal conditions to function at your highest level. When your obedience to purpose is no longer dependent on how you feel, but anchored in who you have decided to become. Because at the deepest level, emotional weakness is not about emotions themselves, it is about identity that has not yet been fully aligned with responsibility. It is the gap between what you are called to do and what you allow yourself to do based on internal comfort. And closing that gap requires repetition, correction, and refusal to negotiate with anything that weakens your consistency. There will be moments when you will want to explain yourself, justify yourself, emotionally validate your reaction. But there is a higher level of living where you no longer need to justify discipline. You simply live it. You embody it. You become someone who is no longer ruled by fluctuation but governed by conviction. And in that place, something powerful happens within you. You stop asking for permission from your emotions. You stop waiting for internal approval before taking necessary action. You stop allowing temporary states to interrupt permanent direction. You begin to move with clarity that is not dependent on mood, but anchored in decision. Now listen carefully to this final truth. Your emotions are not your enemy, but they are not your authority either. They are indicators, not commanders. They are experiences, not instructions. And the moment you reclaim that distinction, you step into a level of personal mastery that most people never reach, not because it is unavailable to them, but because it demands accountability they are not willing to carry consistently. So the question is no longer whether you feel ready.